I spent a lot of time around him, but he said the difference between a story and an argument. And he said there's no story in an argument and there's no argument in a story. And so you can tell them apart pretty easy. And in terms of the power of story is just sort of obvious, I think, for people, right? We're just drawn to stories that are entertaining, that are insightful. But if we think about them as kind of technology, a kind of human technology, then we realize that stories can encode, right? And I don't mean like a sort of moral of the story, you know what I mean? Which parables and things can have. They sort of say, so it's not really about the story, it's about the message. That's not it. I think that misses something too, right? Because there's something around the ability to like navigate the world both with your sense of your own story, right, as an individual, but also part of a greater cosmology, which is so much a part of what makes life meaningful, right?
Welcome, familia, to one more episode of the Man Aligned Podcast. Today we have such a special guest because we sit down with Ian MacKenzie, a visionary artist, filmmaker, and a cultural storyteller. His work weaves through activism, culture, and myth, inviting us to imagine new possibilities for humanity. His creations help us reimagine what it means to be alive, what it means to be a man in a world that keeps longing for renewal and connection. On this beautiful conversation, me, Super G, and Ian, we discuss the masculine archetypes, the stories and the myths that can keep telling the stories of what it is to be a man, and also ways of getting this message moving forward and forward and forward for the future generations through storytelling. On top of that, if you're looking to deepen your connection in community with people and humans that are seeking growth, expansion, you should definitely look into our Man Aligned Mastermind, where we meet every Saturdays, 9 a.m. MST, for an hour and a half calls and master classes. Check out some information on Man Aligned bio or on our website. But now, hope you enjoyed this beautiful episode. Ow!
Hello, family. Welcome back for another Man Aligned Podcast. Today, we have an amazing guest, the mighty, the magical, some may even say mythical, Ian MacKenzie. Thank you so much for joining us today. Ian, we're really happy to have you here.
Thanks for the invite.
Ian, you're a man of many skills and talents. Men's worker, individual coach, film not only creator, but award winner, father, partner, just like the list. I could keep going here, Ian. But one thing we always like to ask first.
We would need a bigger podcast just to list all the skills.
We would. One thing we always like to ask is, who is Ian MacKenzie? Aside from all of these terms and accolades, who are you, brother? Who are you?
Oh, man. I mean, I already want to mess with the question, but I studied with a fellow named Stephen Jenkinson for many years. Some folks might know him. I would consider him an elder. He wrote the book on it, actually called Come of Age. And I'll just remember he told a story about early days when folks were beginning to gather for his school, which occurs primarily out on, well, it did actually until last year, but out on Ontario on their farm. But he spoke about this experience at one of the retreat centers that he also he gave an offering on the West Coast. And he said that one of the practices that I guess folks were used to, this kind of thing, as they are often in transformational spaces, is, they sit in a circle. He's actually not that big on circles, but I won't get into why. But he said, folks often are asked to introduce themselves, right? And he kind of convincingly made the case, actually, that you really are the worst person to introduce yourself to other people, because it's actually other people who experience you and in a way reflect back to you who you are. And so in that sense, it's basically anytime you kind of are offered to speak about who you really are. I mean, of course, it's going to be filtered through your own lens and my own lens, right? Of who maybe I want to be, who I'm trying to show up as. And often I've found it humbling to be reflected back, right, on how I show up and therefore who I am in that case. So that's what's coming to me as you're asking me this question. But so who am I? Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah. What's reflected back to you, Ian, of who you are?
Well, I had a friend one time. Well, he's still a close friend, but he told me one time a while ago. This is more so when I was in my active film days, and as you named, I've been a filmmaker for many years, and over the last 5 years, I've actually been transitioning largely into primarily mythic men's work. But back when I was more in the kind of slipstream of the filmmaking activist kind of scene, one time he called me, or he told me, he said, "You know what? You're kind of like Indiana Jones of the new story." And I thought that was pretty good at the time. I was like, oh yeah, because I was always off to, I was going to, I don't know, South America. I was going to Europe. I was going to Burning Man. I was on the search for how did we get where we are, and by looking to the fringes, right? How do we discover actually what is there to know and to learn and to bring back that creative intelligence from the edge? And so that was largely my role for what felt like about 10 years. And I, humbly said, okay, that sounds pretty good. I didn't have the hat though. I didn't actually have that kind of Indiana Jones hat. I kind of wish I did. But over the last, 5 or 6 years, largely with the birth of my son, I was grounded, metaphorically as well as mostly physically, to life in a different rhythm and to showing up, right, as a father and more in the family. And so, again, I haven't been as active in that regard. So I feel like I hung up my hat, proverbially speaking, largely, and I've been focused now more on rooting in and really with this question of, what does it take to regenerate community, right? Which has also been one of the forefront questions of this film I made about Tamara in Portugal, which we might get into as well. So I'm really, I'm a communitarian. I'm a side DJ on the side. Actually, you didn't say that. That's also in there.
There you go.
Filmmaker, lover, lots of things. So maybe that'll do for now.
Wow. Beautiful. Man, I got one I'll start with. So how do we regenerate community? Ian MacKenzie, this is at least a $1 billion question. How do we regenerate it? Because in my experience, and I know I can speak on behalf of Hugo with this, often in men's workspaces, we find so much disconnection. People coming in just actively craving some form of community. So how do we regenerate it? As Dewey Freeman says, born in relationship, wounded in relationship, and only ever healed in relationship. So how do we bring these back online?
Mm-hmm. Well, after more than a decade now, too, exploring this question, and like I said, which had me go to this community called Tamara in Portugal, which is a 40-year project, really attempting this very thing. What it taught me was actually why we don't have more of it. And there's many reasons, actually, that community, and it can mean lots of things to different people. Yeah. But if we're talking about really like deep, meaningful relationships with other folks, that is both in service to the human realm as well as the rest of life. I mean, it's rare, and it's rare for many reasons, some of which are maybe circumstantial, indirect in a way, not like there's some nefarious cabal at the top kind of making sure there's no community, but it's like it's multivariant, and most of it actually can be boiled down to that to understand what community is, you often need to have experienced it in the first place, right? Like the deep truth of what actually it means to live a meaningful life with other people. And so many of us who live in modern times haven't actually experienced that. So it's a bit like being, let's say a permaculture master takes you to a decimated field, right, where the soil is dried out, there's very little foliage, anything left. And he said, look, if you work hard and we approach it like this could be paradise, right? And if you've never experienced that, you've never been in a rich permaculture food forest or any of that stuff, you might say, come on, no way, right? And like you don't have a reason to work towards it because you've never seen it or experienced it in a meaningful way. So with community, I think a lot of people have an idea of what they think that means or what it means. And then when they start moving towards it, all of the reasons why we have not much of it come swarming to the surface, right? And they realize, maybe or not, what has to be sacrificed on the way to community, which ironically or not, is often all of the stuff that you don't want to let go of, right? Which is your own kind of fixation on your preferences, for one, right? Or that you yourself are ultimately the best arbiter of like who you are. Kind of go back to the first question you asked me, right? Because, for example, I found when in community that the number one skill that I feel like communitarian needs for somebody who's truly willing to work and be in service to community,
Yeah.
is the ability to receive feedback
Ooh.
from other people. If you can't receive feedback from other people, you're not a communitarian. I mean, you have a lot more work to do to get your ego tempered and matured enough so you can actually receive feedback, which, again, from a loving community, is actually in service to your growth.
Yep.
Right? It's in service to your evolution. But if you haven't done that work, you'll fight it, right? And you'll say, well, that's not how I wanted to show up, and they don't get me, and and cause all sorts of mayhem. So I'll pause there.
Wow.
Yeah.
What an answer. Thank you for that, Ian. Sorry, Hugo, you had something you wanted to comment?
I was just gonna say just to add some layers.
A little louder if you can, Hugo.
Yeah. What I was just gonna say is just to add a few more layers into this community base and community setting, because a lot of times people actually ask us, right? Like, what do you guys do at Men Align? And like, yeah, we bring men from their hearts, like from their minds to their hearts, There's all this texting and all this wording. But in the end of the day, what we do is building community. What's lacking is just people being a part of the community. And I think as well is just reframing the way and understanding what community means, right? Because I think as well there's this ideology that we end up creating, that community is this perfect world, and we forget that how Dewey Freeman says that we were born, hurt, and healed in the relationship. So it's not going to be 100% gratitude all the time, but it's part of the work, right? But I feel like, and also the question that I want to put it out is, in order to appreciate community, we also have to have the impact of this community in our lives. So I wanted to ask you, like, what comes up to you and what has changed and what was the impact of a community in your life so you want to regenerate community moving forward?
Well, this, again, largely draws from my time, I mean, with Stephen Jenkinson as well, which was, we would gather twice a year actually on the farm with a good number of folks, maybe I think it was 50, 60, 70 at some points. And in many ways, he would say that we were in the practice of developing village mindedness. And he didn't say, maybe early days, he might have said it's kind of like practicing village. And then he started to realize, okay, well, this is like a temporary assemblage of people that don't really live around each other. A lot of us didn't. And we were coming for a particular reason for a few days, right? But he said, actually, what we could maybe say we were doing was practicing village mindedness, which is in some ways the precursor to village itself. And so when I also then contrast that to my time at Tamara, which was a 40-year community, 3 generations, with a group that lives together on the same piece of land. And they have a very ambitious political vision of like really creating models of what does it take to actually make peace. And they've largely achieved a lot of really beautiful research and sharing of that experience. So when I went there, that's where I felt I also caught the whiff of, oh, this is what it was like for basically all of humanity, right, at a time. And, there are places still that live in versions of that, thank goodness, today. But a lot of us don't have that anymore. So it like stirred an ancestral memory of like, oh, this is what it's like. And I realized that in our, relational ecologies, which is a term also that was inspired by there, living largely in either like nuclear bubbles, with your partner or your family. Some cultures and peoples live a little more, intergenerationally in a single household, right? That can also be a way of, again, expanding the field, but still, in modern society, living somewhat disconnected from each other. And then there's like the nation state, right? The like a form of love or appreciation for people that also are aligned, your sense of belonging to a nation state, right? So I'm Canadian or whatever that happens to be. So at Tamara, what I actually discovered, the more time I spent there, which was five times over 4 years, 4 times over 3 years. A lot of different times I went there, and I really developed what I would call a kind of love for the other people in the community, like the way they showed up, the way they just cared a lot, the way they supported me, the way that I could be brought in to this cultural tapestry. And I would call that a kind of like village love, right? It wasn't like the erotic, like fixation love, it wasn't like the family and a similar love. It's like a different thing. And I was like, oh, this is like a thing that humans used to experience a lot of, right? This like deep love and like the kind of depth that comes from just meaningfully participating in life together with other people. And so there's like a natural intelligence that takes over when you are able to achieve that kind of rhythmic showing up, whether it's for ritual, right? Like marking the processions of the year. We just passed Beltane at the time of this recording, and I know lots of folks are sort of participating now and like coming together for different rituals around this time and all the others. But also, to be human means that you have to cross a number of grief tended thresholds. The births and deaths and endings and beginnings and all these kind of things, right, that are so difficult to do alone, and they shouldn't be done alone. And it takes others to come and gather around to be able to support us through these deep processes. And healing is the same, right? Like when we talk about these transformational spaces that are with other people, they're so alchemically potent because there's other people there. Right. Like when I was convergence, and Graham, we could probably reflect on some of this though, and not just there, but at the Sacred Sons convergence, I really had this feeling one time when we were doing the carpet work, right? The kind of shadow work dynamic where it was like there was facilitators supporting a man going through a process, and that he was able to actually tap in, felt to a deeper like depth of like excavating those patterns or those wounds. Absolutely. And excavate a level of intensity that may on his own may have actually destroyed him.
Absolutely.
Right. But the fact that the other men were around and supporting there and really like diffusing the intensity among this like meta organism, for a moment of healing, for me allowed for a greater capacity for that man to move through his process, and for that energy to be again dissipated and alchemized again, because we're in community. Absolutely. So in a sense, like our capacity to heal grows exponentially in community than alone as well. That's another like intelligence of the way that we could be with each other. So I'll just stop there.
Absolutely. No, I'm in full agreement with that. And, in reference to healing in community, I often like to kind of envision it as our own central nervous system, just keeping us alive. That's the number one goal. And when we gather in community, we're creating a larger central nervous system. One of my friends, Michael Gay, used to kind of explain it in this way. So when a man steps forward or someone steps forward, maybe their central nervous system is saying, no, I can't go here. I can't go to the shakes, to the quakes. But it's actually encouraged by the greater capacity of the group that you speak about, where a man might start shivering or quaking or trembling, going, oh my goodness, I'm safe here in this space. So I love what you were just describing there. So for our listeners, Ian, this beautiful movie that everyone should watch called The Village of Lovers, plus all the other film things that you've ever been a part of, take a look at those as well. Can you kind of give us a rundown of what Tamara is for someone who has no idea?
Could I just add just some comments before we just move in? Because I feel like we're talking about community, and like I literally just got back from 30 days in the Amazon, where you're like literally living 30 days of community life. And I find that, that we brought a few foreigners to that. And I think that like everything that you were describing into people that have never experienced community, that they feel this sense of belonging when they come to an actual community, this really happened. And, and we had a few people actually, like especially men, which is that's what's most like important to me, is like especially the men were there with us. They felt like they have never had a community that they actually belonged it before, that they actually felt this acceptance, that they actually felt that they were a part of it. And just wanted to add this commenting into the community, because like in the end of the day, right, like the community, especially in the southern hemisphere, where like it's mostly tropical countries, and you can live off the land. There's no massive winters where we have to just retreat ourselves. So I think, it's just this ancestral learning that we're some way somehow coming back into it. But when you say regenerate, like just reframe it, we're understanding what's the conditions now that we have, but bringing to the old traditions, because cultural can change with time, but the traditions are the traditions. And in the end of the day, we were born in community, and we're ever gonna thrive in community as well. So yeah, G, feel free to move on. I just wanted to add this.
Yeah, I love that. I love that. So Ian, what is this community of Tamara? What is it all about?
Well, Tamara was started in the early 70s, I believe, or the seeds of it in Germany. And the founders, Dieter Doom, Sabina Lichtenfels, and Charlie Rayner, were really trying to deal with what had happened during World War II, in particular the Holocaust. They were basically the next generation saying, oh my God, how did this happen? Like, how do we prevent this from ever happening again? And Dieter Doom especially was lit with the sense of there has to be another way. Like, how do we create an entirely different system? And they realized that they had to excavate to the deepest layer, all of the ways in which they had been conditioned, not just around like political activism and how to live together, but also around love specifically, like love and relationships and sex and everything. So essentially they kind of prototyped a community for a number of years in Germany, and they started, numbers were gaining. And then for different reasons, they decided, I think it was 95, to expand the community location into southern Portugal. There was a whole pilgrimage that Sabina Lichtenfels, the co-founder, was drawn on and found this, place that felt called to them. And from there, they again continued expanding to about 200 folks, I believe, so now. And they are both recognized for their just really like radical and yet kind of like immense and rich work around love and sexuality partnership. They're kind of mistranslated often as a free love community, but that is not quite it. They use a language called, or this frame of, to free love from fear is what they say, meaning how do we create the conditions where people can love and explore eros and sexuality and partnership, all within a kind of non-idealistic frame of the pair bond. Monogamous pair bond is like it's like, well, no, it can be all these things if we have a field of trust amongst other people that can help us explore, to see our blind spots, right, to see where our work is. And I'll just say they are recognized as world leaders in regenerating ecosystems. And so they've actually built these massive amounts of lakes around the community, which was a fairly dry, dusty, region before, and have now replenished the landscape. And so that's, again, a very testament to both how they regenerate the human realm and how the humans can then help regenerate the ecosystem.
Wow. A place I got to visit. I'll tell you that, Ian. Sounds amazing.
Well,
sounds amazing. So Ian, a lot of your work centers around this ability to tell story in different ways. So how has story impacted your life? And we definitely want to talk about myth in a little bit, but how has story had an impact in your life, and what's the importance of it for you?
Mm-hmm. Well, I'm going to lean on a couple more words from Stephen Jenkinson. I spent a lot of time around him, but he said the difference between a story and an argument. And he said, there's no story in an argument and there's no argument in a story. And so you can tell them apart pretty easy. And in terms of the power of story is just sort of obvious, I think, for people, right? We're just drawn to stories that are entertaining, that are insightful. But if we think about them as a kind of technology, a kind of human technology, then we realize that stories can encode, right? And I don't mean like a sort of moral of the story, you know what I mean? Which parables and things can have. They sort of say, so it's not really about the story, it's about the message.
Yeah.
That's not it. I think that misses something too, right? Because there's something around the ability to like navigate the world both with your sense of your own story, right, as an individual, but also part of a greater cosmology, which is so much a part of what makes life meaningful, right? And I think that, there's a big kind of reckoning, I think, happening with this idea of like so much of religion, of course, provided a lot of cosmological story and purpose for people for a long time. And, the last generations or so, depending on what we're talking about, but they've largely shifted to this kind of humanistic atheism, rational, perspective. And a lot of the younger folk now, especially, are actually realizing, that wasn't that great a move, because the whole, the whole there, and, the rise of men like Jordan Peterson and stuff, I think, are a testament to that. Making the Bible interesting again to a generation that said, yeah, that's boring, that's in the past. But actually the myth and the story are actually deeply meaningful once you know how to actually be in them and work with them. And so for me, again, story was always, I used to read a lot of fantasy books, when I was younger. I was super into role-playing games like Final Fantasy and stuff, in my youth. I was a story, like a fictional story writer for actually a few years in my early 20s. I had a few published. And I would read a bunch of like Stephen King, and then write like a Stephen King style story, and then like I don't know, Dean Koontz and Ray Bradbury. I was big sort of sci-fi, for a while. And then I shifted into film, not too long after. And again, largely because I kind of nakedly thought that film was the quickest way to shift consciousness as quickly as possible. Right. That was sort of my understanding, and I still think it's true. But the sense that that humanity itself seemed to be, or modern society seemed to be driving off a cliff, like a lot of folks, started to clue into that. And for me, I thought, okay, wait a second, how can I help, turn the ship around, participate in that? And so I thought, okay, film, documentary, the transmission of insight and revelation from the edges, right? As we've spoken to, the Indiana Jones, kind of going to the edges and saying, wait a second, maybe this piece will help, steer the ship a little better. That's where I understood the power of story and mythic understanding as well. So I know you don't want to go too far into myth quite yet, but that's kind of my entrance. Yeah.
I love it. So the power of story, and then what's the importance of myth in all of this? Yeah. Because I very much like you, I was a Waldorf teacher for a while, and when I was introduced to the world of myth, it just, I'd come back home, and then being able to learn story and retell them, and it just felt so right. And I know both of us are big supporters of guys like Stephen Jenkinson and Martin Shaw and a whole gamut of others. But what's the importance of myth in someone's life?
Mm-hmm. Well, I think it goes back to, well, again, we maybe have to do a little history lesson for a secon, because
Let's do it.
We love it.
Yeah. Okay. So my understanding is that a lot of the current mythopoetic men's lineage, right, which is of course, we haven't talked about this yet, but a lot of listeners might know Iron John. Of course, Iron John is a fairy tale that was somewhat resuscitated by Robert Bly, and of course the sort of adjunct book of King, Warrior, Magician, Lover. Those are kind of coming from the lineage, the slipstream of, from Bly, or ahead of Bly was Marie-Louise von Franz, who was a pupil of Carl Jung. And so Carl Jung seems to be, again, and of course it was before him, whatever influenced him. And I know there was also indigenous influence in his understanding. But whatever it is that he added to, the stream of this, that there was a shift away from myth or maybe fairy tale as being a kind of like folk thing, right? And an understanding that actually maybe fairy tales and also myth as a grander organism could encode particular insights, both around how to be somewhere, or how to, be life, like maybe you can almost call it like original instructions, right? Often indigenous folks will say, we were given the original instructions and it came through myth. But the idea that the myth or fairy tale pertained to the inner world, I think is a fairly recent phenomenon, right? Like that was really starting with Freud and Jung and all these guys that started to say, oh, wait a second, maybe these things can actually illuminate the inner world. And then of course the danger of that is then it sort of forgets its previous path and it only becomes about your inner world, right? And this is something where storytellers like Martin Shaw would say, well, be careful there, because their stories existed, myth, fairy tales existed pre-human. That's one understanding, right? So they're not human-centric in a way, but they can be harnessed in order to illuminate so much of our inner landscape as well. So again, I just wanted to say that's a fairly recent understanding, and don't lose sight of the roots. That old indigenous understanding of myth is that it's actually the land itself communicating with humans. That's actually ultimately where myth comes from.
Yep.
I love that.
I love that too. and also something else that I really love it is, like, once I was in this big convention of like the youth indigenous community, in a youth community here in Brazil, and it was like over 300 people, where we had the elders, talking with the young generations. And one of the most spiritual, powerful elders, he was telling exactly this to the young. He's like, nowadays you guys are just so concerned into recording the stories that you end up not paying attention and actually being present with the stories, because you can record a story, put into the cloud and lose it. you can write down the story, put that in a piece of paper, and then the piece of paper, there's some wind that hits the paper, goes to the ground. Suddenly there's people stepping on top of the story, and just like the paper like gets smashed down, ripped off, whatever. But we forget just the importance of the presence while we are hearing the story, because when we hear, when we pay attention, when we are present, we can actually embody that, right? Like listen and filter the message, apply that into our lives. But it's just that importance of, when we look into history, when we look into everything that has happened, the story just hasn't changed, right? We just find new ways to keep telling sometimes the same story, so we can just keep engaging, right? Because the way that my parents, the way that your parents used to love hearing stories is definitely different than the way that we are now. But in the bottom line is the same message. And the bottom line is just the same society, that it just has shifted a little bit. And we just gotta find the exact approach, so then it fits in and people receive that message. But it's just the importance of the oral telling story, right? So that we can be in front of people, we can appreciate, because the storytelling often, connecting the 2 points that we've talked right now, also often happens in community, right? Often happens in that community realm too.
Yeah. Yeah. Thank you.
100%. And I'm curious, Ian, what do you see as a storyteller when people aren't, as Hugo was speaking, people aren't imbued with myth or story? What becomes of one when story is non-existent for someone? What do you see?
Interesting. You mean as an individual? Somebody that...
As an individual and as a collective. I mean,
Yeah. Well, this could go in a few directions, but I was just reading an article recently, and I think they were quoting, I don't know if it was Ernst Becker or something, that he wrote The Denial of Death, but it was something like depression is the inability to conjure a future. Right? Like something like that. Yeah. And that, I was like, okay, that's pretty sharp. Right. And so for me, this is the malaise of the times so much, right? Is that people feel like, the sort of technological utopia, which the modern consumer society depicts as worthwhile, right, and worthy of all of our continual effort and distraction, for a lot of folks, just is clearly a mirage. It doesn't seem meaningful, or like the closer you get to it, the less satisfied you are. So there's a kind of recognition, right, of the falsity of that as a guiding mythology, you could say, or guiding cosmology. And in its absence, of course, there's a spiritual hunger, which often folks can fill in a number of ways. It could be addiction, right? It could be numbing out. It could be cults, right? Like seeking a sense of belonging and a kind of a toxic mimic. Or it could be the impetus to actually be willing to dig in and plant the seeds of possibility, right? I think it was Rumi said, if you haven't been fed, become bread. Right. This idea that, so many of us didn't get the things that we should have got if we lived in an intact cultural tapestry. And yet that's not a reason not to, persist and to put the effort in. And so perhaps the next generation could be the one to be on the receiving end. I think that, again, if you then kind of extrapolate en masse, though, to the cosmology of a culture, or you could say the kind of like the seduction when a culture believes it's not, or it's like post mythological. Does that make sense? Like, I think the modern dominant culture kind of pretends, or unconsciously pretends, that it's like post, that's in the past. Like all these people believed all this stuff, but we're beyond that. We're beyond myth. We're striving confidently forward into the future with AI and to the moon or to Mars and everything. But that just means that the mythological context is underground. Doesn't mean it's not there, right? It just means it's not being recognized. And by that meaning, Charles Eisenstein talks at length about this kind of stuff too. Also, Paul Kingsnorth, a writer from the UK, talks about essentially, right, the rise of this like machine consciousness, and which, in many ways he posits as that's the Antichrist. And, we could get into that for a while. I don't want to do that. But the point is that there's always a mythic fundament going on. It's whether or not that you acknowledge it or not, or whether a culture acknowledges it or not. Right. So even atheism is a mythological framework that just believes that there's no spiritual order to things. That doesn't mean it's true. That just means that that's the framework, that the lens that you're looking through, which likely you'll find, right? Because that's what you're looking for.
There's just gem after gem after gem in your answers, Ian. You're just, I don't know what you ate for breakfast today, brother, but you're very on point, and thank you for that. So
definitely proving the point of a storyteller. I just have a little question, because I find it to me that one of the entry points for me to men's work was through the Iron John and also King Warrior Magician Lover, and I think what hits me the most reading on that was just like of course the story, right? Like the myths, and how the myths, they keep playing a role and they keep repeating over and over and over in our society. Is just different times and different timings and different context. But the bottom line of the myths to me gave me that structure of like, oh my God, I'm not alone. Oh my God, I resonate with the myth. I resonate with this messaging. And then just from this lens, maybe diving like a little bit deeper into like the men's work realm, why do you think like the myths and as well the storytelling, because I think storytelling is very important too, why do you think those two parts of this context are important specifically for men?
Well, I mean, I think humans want to feel part of something, right? Part of something magnificent and meaningful. And again, this is the seduction of the kind of human-centric Anthropocene, which is that it sort of fools itself to like in the false grandiosity of the human in this story. It's like the more and more lonely we become, right? It's like, oh, because we're technologically advanced, we don't need all that archaic stuff in the past, like myth and, spiritual belief or whatever. It's like that can be, we're beyond that now. But the problem is the lonelier you become, typically, the longer you do that. So I think a lot of men who are hungry for this, and particularly eldership, right? That was a big thing, and it still is. When they encountered that book, I mean, I did at 35, but I went back and I started to talk to other men who encountered that for the first time back in the early 90s too. And it really tapped into that, what Bly, though, called father hunger, right at the time. A lot of men wanting a kind of expressions of mature masculinity, right? That actually was involved in the stewardship of, masculine maturity and consciousness. But also I think had other qualities though, like could appreciate beauty, right? And a sense of like a grander cosmology to participate in. And so I think that for men, I mean, that is a kind of sustenance, right? Especially when, it's head down and, being the provider or trying to kind of like invent ways of, or things that are meaningful to chase, right? This is where the kind of false idols that are spouted by men like Andrew Tate, I think, and the rest of this kind of, it's understandable, but it's very boyish, right? Like get the women, get the status, be in the hierarchy. It's it makes sense within the framework that the adolescent boyish consciousness is operating within, thinking that those things will provide the kind of spiritual sustenance that is ultimately, of course, the longing from a deeper place. And so I think for men, again, like stepping now, encountering this kind of mythic frameworks and the sustenance that can come with that is a revelation, right? And has been for men, even ever since, again, Bly first published that book, which I think was on the bestseller for many weeks, and is now under this third revival. I just spoke with a fellow, Chris Kyle, who is actually, he's calling for this men's summit called the Big Tent Summit, happening in a couple of weeks in Colorado. But he believes there's actually been 3 waves of the mythopoetic men's scene. And the first one was, the Bly moment where we talked about King Warrior Magician Lover, all that stuff. And then he thinks after that came kind of like the call for more embodiment, which was more like David Data and these kinds of like, neo-tantra, like these kind of things. And that was great. That kind of, willingness to get more into the body and into the, somatic layers, all that obviously very important. And that today we're also at a moment where these things now can beautifully cross-pollinate. right? Because I do know, if men are kind of only though in the sort of philosophical, intellectual, mythic dimension as well, like if they only read the book King, Worm, Magician, Lover, it's interesting and it obviously has a lot of insight, but it doesn't really come alive until you start applying and living and, quote, doing the work and all that kind of stuff. Right now it becomes this interchange, like the mythic becomes embodied and the embodied becomes mythic. And that's, I think, where we're at now.
Ooh, I love that. I'm curious.
It always comes back.
Yeah.
It always comes back in a circle. Yeah.
Circles. I'm curious. You just mentioned about eldership. I'd love to hear from you. What's your view on eldership and what makes an elder, or how does this happen? Because I know for me and Hugo, we see this a lot at Man Aligned, where there is that sort of longing for a father, longing for eldership, and I've personally felt that in my own life quite a bit. So, what would you define eldership as being, and what supports someone to be in that role, if you would? Mm-hmm. I know that's a big question.
Yeah, but thankfully, again, I spent a number of years with Stephen Jenkinson, and again, he wrote the book, book on it, Come of Age. But and other sources too that I've drawn from and experienced. For me, I think elder is one who, understands that elder is not an identity; it's a function. Right? It's a function, meaning there are particular times when eldering is called for. And even knowing when those moments are is a function of elderhood, in my opinion. Right? So because somebody who hasn't been steeping in this kind of, self work, being tempered, gone through certain, their own rites of passage and all this kind of stuff, like it's very hard to like turn it on when you're 60 or 70 if you haven't done any of this stuff. Right. So on the one hand, it often requires a kind of approach over time. This is why he often would call the younger folk elders in training. Right. Elders in training. And so one, it's a capacity to recognize when the function of elder is needed is one mark of an elder. But also recognizing that your primary focus is actually no longer on yourself at a certain point. But it doesn't mean like you sort of, because you're perfect and now you don't need to do any more work. It's not that, but you start to realize that your way of beginning to kind of tend your own wake and the men that come after you, for example, if we're talking about, let's say in men's spaces or life itself, like to me, that's the radar that an elder has. It's actually what does life need, right? From this moment, what do the youngers need coming up? And oftentimes it's not to be your buddy, right, as well. Like I said, I'm sure you can have deep relationships with elders, right? But I've heard this too, that, when in a ceremonial time or a ceremonial, function or unfolding, it's like the elders are the ones that are actually sharpening you. They're not letting you off the hook, actually, right? Because there's something at stake, which is also the mark of an elder to know, particularly in ceremonial contexts, right? That there's, things afoot and, you need people willing to show up. And in particular, even in like, say, men's processes, like if I'm at a gathering with men too, right? And maybe I'm facilitating or maybe there's other facilitators, but I know there's a few elders there. Then I feel like the capacity of the group goes way up. Absolutely. Right? Like I feel like we can kind of get into territory that without them there, I might get nervous, right? If like a process opens up or some wobble happens or big energy, gets tapped or something. And if, if I look over and there's a couple of elders there and like I look over and they're like, their things are good. I'm like, okay, good. Let's keep going. Right. So again, it kind of creates a ballast to have elders in your midst. Again, because they're tracking things in layers and, that they've seen, again, that's the other mark of an elder, right? They've seen a lot of this stuff over and over, and they've been willing to learn from it and not to be, heroically triumphant, but to just, again, this notion of tempering, right, comes up a lot. They've just been tempered by it. They've been diminished and deepened, not diminished and weakened. Yeah.
They've been diminished and deepened.
And like indigenous would say here in Brazil, the elders are the living libraries.
Yeah.
That we can just go and ask anything and all the information is just gonna be there. Like it's nice to hear your frame on this, because I can just feel how much you have been impacted and inspired by both the stories, both the elders as well, the myths, and maybe just like coming into like a deeper layer now, just wanted to ask you, what was like a breakthrough moment in your life that you found a myth, a story, or an elder that like something clicked to you and were like, oh my God, where have I been this whole time?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I'll say one I can do brief and one I can expand a little more. But, I'll say in terms of elder, and I say this from also an understanding that elders are the future embodied in the present. Right? That's another way to think of it. I think it's like they are you, maybe, 10, 20, 30 years ahead now. So they, as Stephen would say, Jenkinson, he'd say like they are the embodiment of time actually present among you, which is a pretty, wild when you start to really let that in. And so meeting Steve in 2012 was certainly that encounter for me. That, I won't get into the story of how I met him, but something awoke in me. I was like, whoa, it's possible that this is possible later on in life, right? To be a certain way, to show up a certain way. Because so many of the adults that I'd been around, and maybe like you as well, displayed very few of these qualities, right? And I would say now, with the language I have, I might say they're olders, but not elders.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Right. They're just sort of in their prolonged adolescence, right? And they're, give or take, in an older person's body, but they could be in their 30s, like the way they're showing up often. And I don't mean that disparagingly in the sense, I just mean that without the appropriate rites of passage and, processes to guide and mature one's consciousness and soul, which is generally the job of the culture, right? It's actually very difficult to pull off on your own. Like you're kind of, you need like your own hero's journey again and again to kind of like bootstrap your way to it. And some people can do it. It's just, it's not that effective, actually. It's much more effective to have a culture do it. But again, when we have not few cultures around that still practice these ways, and there's reasons that they were diminished and shamed and, for colonization and all this kind of stuff. So basically, if you look around and you say, what happens if we lose all our practices of rites of passage and all this stuff? It's like, oh, you don't have to surmise it because that's what we have. We have basically many generations, depending where we're talking about, where we don't practice these anymore. And so we have what we have. So now we're, rebuilding these. And so meeting Steve was like that. And, he's got a wild story and I won't go into it. But from a woman's side, though, and this is what I could spend a little more time in, it was meeting Sabina Lichtenfels, the co-founder of Tamara. Who and again, I think she was at the time, it might have been her early 60s, maybe. And I think now maybe late 60s, early 70s. But for me, and again, she's a force of nature. Like she very sweet and like grandmotherly. But then when I saw her introduce the forum, which is a particular practice in Tamara, which is really like a group process, kind of a ritual of group process that they've been using for many years and developed over time. You see it in the film, so whoever watches it, you'll see a scene of it. But she introduced the forum at one point in the middle of the Global Love School, which I was part of. And what I thought was a bit of, this grandmotherly, somewhat, just very like sweet and nice. She suddenly was this, witchy, crone, theatrical, again, like tour de force that was, at times kind of like erotic and like, I wouldn't say sexy in a way, but like it kind of had this like erotic charge to it, to like playful and clownish. And I was like, oh my God, an older woman can be this. Right. And what I would call that mythically is the crone, right? This is the crone energy, of which I, again, had very little experience or encounters with. But it's what happens when women, after they get past middle life and are held within a culture where they're held in esteem, actually, right, as a necessary and important medicine that they're bringing. Whereas in the dominant West, right, primarily older women, you get past a certain age and you become invisible, right, because you're no longer erotically appealing to like the patriarchal order. And so, you sort of like just go away kind of thing, right, disappear. Whereas in cultures that actually recognize the power and the necessity of the medicine they bring, they flourish, right? And I saw that with a lot of the older women in the community. that they were like vibrant and still like erotic in a totally different way, and wise. And so for Sabina, when I met her too, it was this like aha moment of, oh, this is possible. Like this kind of energy, this is crone energy in the world, and it's so important.
Yeah, I think it's just very important what you said of how our society just define things as old when they're just like elders, right? Because when it's old, it doesn't serve anymore, right? So it's like an old
Mm.
car, an old something, like it just what's lying underneath it is just we cannot use it anymore. Let's just get a new one, so we don't need to give attention to that. Versus
Mm.
the word elders, like to me, that brings the respect. That brings like you're an elder because there's a lot of experience. Because you've had, that's what my dad tells me. Like I've had your age and you've never had my age, and I'm like, hey, it's a very truthful point. And I think
Yeah.
that's why I really like just the reframing, because it's very easy to be like, oh yeah, like this person is old. I'm like, yes, he's old, but he's also an elder, right? So if we're just calling and just putting him in this box on this
Yeah.
label of like he's old, we're basically saying that to society he doesn't have anything to serve anymore. And on the other hand, he has a lot of experience, and once he starts sharing that experience, that can serve actually to a lot of us. So
Yeah.
I really like this reframing.
Mm-hmm. Thank
So,
you.
Ian, can you tell us a little bit about the Mythic Masculine? What's this organization that you run all about?
Sure.
How does it function?
Yeah. Well, my maybe third film was about female electronic DJs. Right. It was sparked by seeing a particular artist, and I was very intrigued. Like, I feel like she's doing something very different. Like, the meme of the rise of the feminine was really kind of coming forth. This is sort of like 2013, 2014. And so I was like, no, there's something here. And following that thread, ended up co-creating a film project that was also a graphic novel and a motion comic series called Amplify Her, which folks can check it online. That was the first time I was introduced actually to like the mythopoetic, and it was actually through the female side, right? So I read Clarissa Pinkole's Estes, Women Who Run with Wolves, read Marion Woodman as well. These these Jungian mythologists, and then it was after that journey I found Iron John. So I'll just say that I kind of like went through the women's side first, which was really interesting to me. Yeah, and then I was like, maybe there's something for men, and then I found Iron John. But again, when Amplify Her had come out, I remember some women were saying, "Hey, you should do the same for men," and I was like, "Oh, interesting. I don't know if that's it. Like, I don't know if I wanted to make a film about this territory with men." But I was like, what other medium could I expand into that I had no experience of yet? And I chose podcasting. Because again, I really like the interviews as part of documentaries, and podcasting, of course, is not all of the formats, but a lot of them are this kind of long form interview as we're doing now. And so I was like, oh, this could be interesting. So I tried it out, and that was 5 or so years ago. It started as a podcast, the Mythic Masculine Podcast. And on one hand, it was meant to kind of connect the generations with, again, this previous mythopoetic wave. And I went back and interviewed like Michael Mead and other folks that were part of that initial wave, and then expanded the conversation into others like Indigenous elder Pat McCabe, and so many now, 70 plus interviews, I think so far. And that's how it started. And so naturally, as I started to release this work, I had other folks, men and women, also come to me and say, "Hey, how can I dive deeper?" And I said, "Okay, maybe I could offer something around this territory." And I'll just say, 5 years later, it basically has expanded to largely focus on a particular archetypal dimension, which, of course, in the main quadrant, as was already named, King, Warrior, Magician, Lover. I find that there's a fair amount of men's organizations that will explore the warrior, right? Even the magician and the king. But there's not many that I understand now that explore the lover as the primary archetype of focus. Yeah. And so that's been, with my collaborator, Davis Fortier, that's been the focus for the last 2 years, has actually been how do we create a body of work around the exploration of the lover. And so, that's mostly where we're at right now.
That's amazing. And thank you for doing that. And just as a side note to our listeners, all of your podcasts are amazing, but the one I don't know if you have more than one, but there's one with Stephen Jenkinson where it is, you think there's wisdom bombs happening right now. Wait till you listen to that one. That one, I replayed that quite a few times, and I couldn't drive and listen to it at the same time because I was always writing, going,
Amazing.
wow. So thank you.
Glad that worked out.
Yeah, amazing stuff. We always ask one question before the end. That's the same for everyone, but the responses are often, they're just unique and special. So we'd invite you, just an invitation to really dig your feet into the ground where they meet and greet the earth. Close your eyes down, take a few deep breaths, and whatever comes through for you. But the invitation is this. I want you to imagine yourself in an open field. And within this field, there are your parents, your parents' parents, their parents, their parents, their parents, and so on. 7 generations, possibly more, back. And amongst them is your son and his unborns, and their unborns, and their unborns, and their unborns. 7 generations forward. And this is a moment in time where Ian MacKenzie has a chance to powerfully and potently speak to all of these people. And what would you tell them? What would you tell them?
Some high stakes. What do I tell them? I mean, part of it, what comes to me is, I'd say, I'll do my part. I got my part. You got yours. Feels like a appropriate amount of heft or weight to carry. But also, just a sense of gratitude to being part of something, right? Like something unfolding into the past and unfolding into the future. So a sense of, but maybe that's more of a feeling than a message per se. Yeah.
I'll do my part. That's beautiful.
I'll do my part and you do yours. And gratitude. Ladies and gentlemen, all of those around, thank you, Ian MacKenzie. Thank you for your time. Thank you for your wisdom. Thank you for just being you. Whatever you went through, thank you. Man, what a gift. What a gift. Where can people find Ian MacKenzie outside of this little podcast? Where do they find you?
Yeah, well, welcome to go check out themythicmasculine.com. That's a good place to be. And I've got a Substack, which is one way you can also subscribe to the podcast. Of course, you can find it on Spotify, Apple, wherever. Also, my Instagram is somewhat regularly updated as well. It's ian.mackenz. And otherwise, come say hello, send a message. Yeah, check out.
Absolutely.
We're definitely going to add all this information, your website, your Instagram info into the description of this podcast, so everybody can drink more of this source, of this just living library that is just sharing codes and insights. It was just beautiful, bro, to meet you, to hear a little bit more of your story, and honestly, like, while you were speaking, I'm just thinking about how much I would crave to be sitting around a fire, just to listen, just 1% of what you were told or what you received. Because, like, stories, I think, like, G is also like an amazing storyteller. So I'm someone that really appreciates a good storyteller, because you can make something that's nothing into big story that can be viewed in many different ways. But I think it's just this ability to actually keep people engaged, to keep people focused, and also present, right? And also present, because for you to be a good storyteller, you have to be present, so you can keep people present. And presence is just this gift that we can share, right? In community and also in groups.
Yeah, and I'm thinking of the words of Martin Shaw, who, by the way, he's in tour. We brought him over to Canada, so we're kind of in mid-flight right now with him. But he says, as for a storyteller, one of his best pieces of advice, he says, is less persona and more presence.
I love it.
So I hear you speak of that.
I love it.
Thank you so much, Ian,
Okay.
for your time. We love this. And anytime you want to come back, you're always welcome. And hope to see you around the fire soon.
Okay, thanks to you. All right, guys.
See you, my brothers.
Ciao.